I would say the number one thing is for you to know exactly what the purpose of your fundraise is going to be, right? So that's the most important thing. I think for me, if you have that in mind and you have a very clear vision of what you want to achieve, then go about it. If you haven't cleared up that vision yet, it always will come true during your investor meetings and discussions. And they're going to pick it up, right? They're going to pick it up very quickly that you are not ready yet. And you don't want to start off in the ECF round or your first round, whether it's a seed round or a Series A round, and you haven't figured out the basics yet, right? So you really want to have that credibility before you go out and speak to people, and that could be as simple as understanding where your product market fit is, who are your customers. You might not have huge traction, but you need to have a conviction in what you're trying to do and trying to achieve.
Welcome to the Getting Funded MY podcast by iSearch. Today we have Arun, the CEO of eVULX, on the show. So eVULX is a company that specializes in providing gamified learning simulations. So companies can now learn about the world of business and management through fun simulation. So today I'll be discussing with Arun on how eVULX managed to obtain 300K in funding. So welcome to the show, Arun.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's begin. Could you share about the story of eVULX and also what are the problems that you guys aim to solve?
Sure, that's a good question. So we kind of started in 2020, but actually our origin kind of goes back a little bit further than that. We actually are kind of a spin-off from a larger learning and development company in Malaysia called Leaderonomics. So Leaderonomics has been in Malaysia for the last 13 years or so. And over those years, we had developed simulations, or in a kind of like a parlance term, it's more like games for organizations, right? So for learning and development for employees in organizations. And over the years, we kind of developed them, but they were mainly physical simulations, so very human-to-human kind of games. And last year, obviously, due to COVID and the MCO restrictions in Malaysia, we decided there was an opportunity to virtualize and digitize a lot of those physical simulations, right? So last year, we kind of went out with that strategy. We created eVULX International, which was different from Leaderonomics. We wanted to brand ourselves slightly differently. Our entire mission and our purpose is really to take unorthodox learning to the world, right? To digitize corporate games for employees and organizations. So we do that by playing virtual games, digital games, and all of them have a certain learning methodology behind them. They have a certain theory that we want to teach. So for example, if you are playing a game on leadership or influencing skills, there is an underlying theory behind the simulation. And what we do is we run these simulations for employees of organizations, and in the process, we train them up in those skill sets. So we are using a very different model where in the past it was mainly a trainer and a classroom kind of setting. Now we are using digital games, and in some countries, in some regions of the world, they are even moving into virtual reality, augmented reality, right? So that's kind of the spectrum of where we came from. So very much still a Malaysian company, but our customer range is not only in Malaysia, but regionally as well.
So the games, what topics do you cover in the games? Since it's very broad.
So we generally cover soft skill development. So when I mean soft skill development, I mean leadership, influencing skills, communication, teamwork, collaboration. But we also have a lot of business simulations. So what we find is that a lot of customers, usually they are targeting their high potentials in their organization. It might be mid-level employees or senior level employees, and they want to teach these employees business strategy, financial acumen skills, because they want to prepare them for the next line of leadership, right? So a lot of our games also incorporate a lot of business theory. How do you come up with financial models? How do you run an organization virtually, right? How do you take a role as a CEO, and how do you turn around a business? And all of it is done through games and case studies. So we have a combination of both. The one that we don't do is technical areas, right? So we are not in the space of, for example, specifically, in the medical line. But there are companies around the world that specifically target certain industries. We are more on the soft skill side, but also on the business strategy, business acumen side, right? And that's because we also came from that background, right? From Leaderomics, which is more of a leadership development company. So a lot of the games that we created over the years were along those lines. So when we wanted to virtualize and digitize them, obviously we kept to that kind of model. But in the future, we do see there is a lot of space, even in technical areas, and a lot of people come to us and say, are you able to create games for the medical sector, right? So instead of teaching somebody in a classroom how to perform a surgery, you do it via a virtual or a digital game, right? So there are a lot of opportunities, but currently what we do is we mainly focus in the soft skill and the business strategy area. Yeah.
Okay, so is there like a target cap that a company needs to have? Let's say they need to have like 5 employees minimum to be able to, say, purchase this learning platform.
Yeah. So actually, we have multiplayer games, but a lot of our games are actually single player as well. So to answer your question, one single person even can buy our game, right? So it's not really a game that you need to have 5, 10, 50 people to play it, right? There are some of our products that are more team-based. So for those, we usually encourage organizations to have a group of 20 people, for example. But generally, we have even digital simulations that can run for a single individual. And it can be scaled up to thousands of employees because it's a digital solution. So really, there is no limit, and the minimum is one person, right?
Would there be grades at the end, or like a passing mark, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so for every game, there is a gamification element to it, right? So there needs to be incentive for you to do as well as you can do, right? So for example, one of our games, you play a role of a sales leader and you have to motivate your sales team. And all of this is done through a digital game, obviously. So the company you work for, all of this is fictional. It's in the context of the game itself. But at the end of the day, your score, or how well you perform in the game, is the percentage of sales that you get versus the target that you are set in the beginning of the game. And for a lot of our digital games, at the end of the game, the participant actually gets an auto-generated digital report, which they can easily download. It's a PDF file, and this is something that they get at the end of the game, which kind of tells them throughout their gameplay what did they do well, what could they improve on, and that is also a form of a debrief for them, right? So they can take it away. It's a takeaway for them, and they can study it, they can reflect on it, and they can, kind of use some of the theories in their day-to-day roles, right? And that's the essence of what we are trying to achieve. We are not just playing games for the sake of playing games. What we are trying to do is use games as a form of learning, right? And it's mainly targeted to B2B organizations, but we are starting to slowly develop solutions for the B2C model as well.
Could you explain more about the B2C model? Because the B2B is very clear already. So what about the B2C one? So
B2C is mainly, we saw an opportunity that there are segments of our society, for example, school kids, high school kids, even university students, that could benefit by having certain games. For example, in Malaysia, I think we have a very big problem around financial literacy, right? We have one of the highest bankruptcy rates in the region among the youth. So instead of teaching you how to manage your finances or how to become more financially literate, right, I can do so in a very different way, right, using digital games, right? And, today, I think the way we are interacting with content and info is very different from the past. I mean, today we are consuming content in 15-second kind of videos from TikTok, or, the content is getting a lot shorter. So sitting in a classroom where a trainer kind of teaches you concepts and theory is having less impact than it used to have, right? So we need to find ways to drive up learning, retention, and engagement. And we think that one of the big solutions is through games, right? And we know how big the B2C gaming community is globally, right? But that's mainly in the entertainment kind of gaming area, right? But it's a very huge industry on its own. But what we are trying to do is we are trying to turn it on its head and say that we can do the same approach, but we can do it for learning.
Okay, sounds interesting. So next product rollout would be to target like high school kids and also uni students to learn like financial literacy and other skills that they can apply in their later life.
Yes. So I think currently we have a current product in development. I think that's still a B2B product, but B2C is something that we want to probably focus on early next year onwards. So more of a year 2022 kind of product.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. So let's move on to the funding process. So eVULX have raised 300K from crowdfunding. So could you share how's the funding journey like?
Sure. So the funding journey was about 5 months long, I would say. We went through Pitch in Malaysia, which is obviously a very big ECF platform in the region actually now. And, we kind of started off just inquiring about the process through them. And we knew about them through the work that they did for Littleromics over the last few years, right? We also had an investment round done for Littleromics a couple of years back. So that's where we knew about them and we knew their process. So the beginning phase was really about the documentation. And I think that is all the due diligence that every company has to go through to get onto the platform, which is quite straightforward. And then you get into a phase which is called pre-live, which is really the most important phase actually. It's really where you start connecting with investors, and private individuals who understand what you're trying to do, who want to support you, right? And that's a very important stage. I would say that stage kind of lasted about 2.5 months because that's where we really had to focus on getting as much investors on board and for them to give us a kind of a strong commitment that they were going to invest in us. And then once that stage is done, and when you're confident you have enough investors, you move on to the next stage, which is the live stage. And the live stage is when your deal is made public on the pitch-in platform. You can go in. Anyone can go in. Anyone in the public can really just sign on, register themselves, and have a look at all the deals that are available, right? And that phase lasted for us about 5 to 6 weeks. It's generally always shorter than the pre-live. The pre-live is usually longer because that's where the bulk of the work happens. And then we kind of ended it towards the end of March, I believe. Right. And the additional benefit is obviously, we were incentivized because the government was also offering a matching grant, right? So for any ECF platform, company that is on an ECF platform, they are entitled to a 1 in 4 match by the government. And that was through an initiative called MySIF. Right. So a lot of companies were on the platform. So if you raise, for example, 400,000, the government would give you 25% of that. So 1 to 4. So they will give you an additional 100,000, right? No questions asked. So it was a very good incentive. And I think a lot of companies took that advantage. Last year, the incentive was even higher. It was 1 to 2. So it actually gave you 50% of what you raised. So some companies, if they raised $1 million, they would have got 500,000 straight away from the government, right? And the process was very, very quick. I think it was only about 1 week for the money to come in from the government. So it was a very interesting incentive, and I believe a lot of organizations from Malaysia did take that opportunity, right? So definitely, overall, it was about a 5-month period, quite a lot of stress because you have to talk to a lot of investors. Obviously, some don't know what you're doing, so you need to do a lot of work to try to convince them of what the future looks like for the company, whether you have a strong team, is there product market fit, and all of that kind of discussion. But eventually, we managed to cross the line. We were expecting to close less than that, so we actually managed to secure much more than we initially aimed for. So that's always a good thing. But definitely a long process, but definitely worth it. Learned a lot in the process as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just like you mentioned, the first stage would be due diligence stage, right? So what do founders need to prepare before they go through this due diligence phase to, get a more smooth process for the next step?
So generally it depends on the ECF platform that you go on. I know that there are different due diligence processes that happen for every different ECF company out there. But the one for pitching was pretty straightforward. I think because they have done it for many companies over the years, they have a pretty standard template of documentation that they need from the organization. And obviously some of them would be your SSM documentation, but it will also be kind of an Excel file, I believe, that kind of looked at your projections, what was the current shareholding structure of the company, what was your mission statement, information about your general products and services. And all of that information was also being collected so that they could create a landing page for you of course, right? So when you go onto their platform, if you go into, for example, eVULX or any other company on the platform, you will see a whole host of information about the company, right? And all of that is done during the due diligence phase, right? Where the companies essentially pitch in, this is what I'm trying to do, this is where I plan to spend the money, is it for marketing, is it for product development, is it for hiring? So all of that information is being collected in the initial stage, which is the due diligence stage, and kind of pitch in, make sure that everything is done. The other step is that they need to apply for a trust, right? So all that money that you collect essentially sits under a trust account, right? So the application for the trust account takes about a month and is done through one of the banks in Malaysia, right? So that process takes about a month. So obviously the bank would have their own set of documents that the company would need to fill in. But I would say that would be one of the biggest chunks of it, the trust application. And the reason why they use trust is because that Sdn Bhd has a certain limit as to how many shareholders can sit on your books, right? The limit is 50. So if you go onto ECF, you could easily get more than 50 people, and then you run into a problem, right? So what the trust allows you to do is that it allows you to, all those investors, whether you raise it from 10 or 1,000 investors, all sit under just one line account, right? So that keeps your cap table kind of clean and allows you to raise for more people than you usually would.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So the next stage would be the pre-live. So just now you mentioned that pre-live, you're already speaking to many investors about eVULX product. But then I thought it's like when live only you start to speak with the investors. So could you just clarify that part?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of something that most people would assume, right? And I think a lot of organizations and startups, they go into it thinking along those lines. But I think that's one of the learning points that most organizations go through, unless they've spoken to people who have gone through it. That there are these two phases. You have the live and the pre-live, right? And the pre-live obviously is the first step. And so actually, that's the phase that is very, very critical. And for any startup, any organization going onto ECF, that is the phase that you need to prioritize 90% of your efforts on, right? Because that's the phase where you start to talk to a lot of investors, secure commitments. And let's say you're raising $1 million or $300,000, like in our case, right? You need to sort of get to a point where you're extremely confident that you can reach the 300,000 mark, right? Because that would mean that your overall funding is a success, right? So in our case, we went up to $210, I think, $1,000 before the government put in a single cent even in tied up kind of commitments from investors. And so when you do that, you get a lot of momentum. And when you go live, let's say you're raising $1 million and you've kind of secured 800,000 already. When you go live on day one, minute one, you already show that you're 80% funded, right? And that gives a lot of confidence to public and retail investors, right? Because they say, oh wow, this company is already 80% funded and it's just first day, right, of the launch. And that's where you see the public also jump on the bandwagon and try to invest. And it depends on what the minimum threshold is, right? For us, it was 1,000 ringgit. So anyone which had a minimum of 1,000 ringgit could invest. Some companies set it even lower at 500. Some companies set it higher, right? So we wanted the public to be able to invest, and I think 1,000 ringgit was a good threshold. And we saw that some people came on board after the live period, but I would say the biggest portion is the pre-live, to set yourself up for success, so that at the end, when you go live, you have a very, very strong chance of closing the round successfully, which is what you want to do, right? So I would say to any investor or any kind of startup owner, that's the main focus area that you need to be focused on.
So in the pre-live stage, how do you get the investors to trust eVULX?
Well, combination of things. Obviously, you need to talk to people who already understand a little bit of what you're doing. You can talk to customers sometimes who already have used your product in the past. Obviously, family and friends is a big one, especially for startups. And myself included for eVULX as well. Those were one of my big kind of supporters in the beginning, right? And you need those kind of groups of people to push you out. And I think that would be the same for a lot of startups out there. But yeah, you need to be able to connect to people and then to get referrals, right? So sometimes you might speak to a high network individual and they might seem interested, right? And they might invest a certain amount, right? Let's say 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, whatever. It's also good for you to ask them, can you refer me to other people in your network that you think would be interested in this opportunity, right? And I find that is a very strong approach, because when a high net worth individual refers you to another high net worth individual, that credibility is already established, right? So it makes the process slightly easier, right? And true story for us, for one of our investors that invested a very big chunk of money into the business, the process of talking to him and convincing him was done within 20 minutes, all right? Because I was referred to him by a very close friend of his who had also invested, right? And he believed in this person, and if he had done his due diligence, it must be good to invest, right? So that credibility plays a big role. But obviously there are some people out there that you can talk to them for like 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and they still won't be convinced, right? So you need to be able to know when also to stop and move on, because it is a numbers game, right? At the end of the day, you don't want to just speak to 10 people. You really need to be speaking to a couple of hundred people, to be honest, to get where you want to get. And if you're not established, if you're not a very well-known founder, right? If you're a very well-known founder, if you're a serial startup, entrepreneur, sometimes your credibility plays a big role, right? And people believe in you because they know who you are. You might be a public figure. But for startup owners which are going into it firsthand, it really takes a lot of time, and it really takes a lot of effort to just talk to as many people as you want. You need to take the initiative to have webinars where you invite people, so that you don't need to waste time calling each one of them. You can kind of explain it to 10 people, 20 people in one forum, rather than calling each one of them and spending an hour on the phone with each one of them, right? So you need to do a lot of creative solutions to maximize your time, but it's really up to the organization and the startup owner to really decide that, right?
I like the referral strategy.
Yeah,
It's like free, and you don't have to waste so much time again to repeat the same thing over again.
Exactly.
Okay. So having raised 300,000, how do you plan to utilize these funds?
Sure. Yeah, for us, our plan was really to invest that into product development, right? So
more games.
More games, exactly. So for eVULX, we are a product development company, right? So we want to create more games, and then we want to license it to the world, right? So for us, it was really about how do we invest in certain games that we had in mind already. They were already kind of designed, and now needed to just go to the next step to do it, software development, and to do all the UX UI design to get the product into a finished commercialized product, like at the end of the day. So we wanted to invest into the product development side, but also we wanted to invest in building up the team. I think this was a big one as well, that I wanted to invest to really beef up the team, so that the team was able to execute and able to succeed, because at the end of the day, I think it comes down to what your commitments are to your investors, right? So, if you make certain revenue projections or revenue or profit projections that you tell investors, this is what my targets are going to be, then you really need to set yourself up for success. And sometimes that includes structuring the team in such a way that allows you to achieve those goals. Right, so we did both. We kind of hired the team, we kind of beefed up the organization a little bit, and we also kind of invested most of it into product development as well. Right, so those would be the two big categories. I mean, we did allocate some funding for marketing and sales as well, and that's something that we are continuously doing at the same time. But I would say the big ones would be the hiring the team and the product development side.
Is it difficult to hire? Because you talk about product development, is it difficult to hire a game developer in Malaysia? Because it's something very unorthodox, and I don't think many of us have learned this sort of degree or courses during uni time.
Yeah. So definitely, I think yes. The answer is yes and no. I think what you'll find is that there are people who are not technically game developers, but they are very good programmers. So they have the skill set. It's now just applying it in a different field, right? Applying it in games. So what they lack is usually the game design, right? Which is what we have, right? So we design games, the functionality of the game, how the learning is supposed to come through, what is the theory behind it, what is the flow, what is the design and everything. What we need is somebody to take that and to develop it into a digital game, right? So that it's fun to play, it's fully digital. So to be honest, I think if you're looking for a programmer who has that kind of knowledge set, I think Malaysia does have that talent. But obviously, if somebody, it's very hard to find somebody who has that talent, but also has the element of game design, right? That's very unique, lah. I think a person who has both would be very in demand, lah. Right? So what we try to do is we also not only try to hire kind of developers in that space, but we also look at external freelance guys, right, who have the capability for certain areas, and then we work with them, right? Eventually, I think as we grow, I would want to bring all those skills internally, right, to the team, so that we can control the entire universe of the design, right? But I think as a startup, you need to be a bit logical as well in your approach and see that, maybe I don't have a UX UI designer on board, but maybe that is something that I can really freelance or outsource to somebody else. And I can focus on the core element of the game, which is the design and the functionality and how it moves and how it plays, right? So that, to me, is where the IP really sits, lah. It's in the game design, right? And the UX UI is just sitting on top of that, and so it really depends on what your strategy is and what kind of product you're building in essence, lah. But I think Malaysia is getting there, lah, slowly. We are seeing a lot more people who are very active in the freelance space in the game development side. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. It's also really competing with other game developers, not only in Malaysia but around the region, to get the best talent, lah.
Where do you manage to find all these freelance talents?
Sometimes it's through referrals. So once you know certain individuals in the network, in this space, it's not a very huge community, right? So there are a lot of people who refer us to certain individuals that have certain skill sets. They have been tested before. They might have already developed games before. They have kind of a track record, a portfolio, right? So what we do then is try to approach them and work out a freelancing structure with them, so that they can continue to work in their day-to-day roles, and some of them are working in tech companies in Malaysia or in the region, and they do this as a side role as well. So I think a lot of it is due to referrals. I mean, you can go on to a lot of these digital platforms to go and hire this talent, but it's a very hit and miss kind of strategy because you don't really know them. And some of them might be in places like India, Pakistan, Vietnam, and it's very hard for you to authenticate the work that they're doing and the stuff that they are telling you that they've done, right? So there are obviously some horror stories of people who trusted them and then kind of like got burnt in the process. But you need to sometimes take referrals and get, whenever someone gives you a reference, always call them up and always ask the questions, what do you think about this person's work? Really, you need to do your homework to ensure that the person that you're entrusting a lot of this IP with is actually going to come through and it's going to do the job that they promised at the end of the day.
All right, got it. So what's your number one advice for entrepreneurs who wish to raise funds for their business?
I would say the number one thing is for you to know exactly what the purpose of your fundraise is going to be, right? So that's the most important thing. I think for me, if you have that in mind and you have a very clear vision of what you want to achieve, then go about it. If you haven't cleared up that vision yet, it always will come true during your investor meetings and discussions. And they're going to pick it up, right? They're going to pick it up very quickly that you are not ready yet. And you don't want to start off in the ECF round or your first round, whether it's a seed round or a Series A round, and you haven't figured out the basics yet, right? So you really want to have that credibility before you go out and speak to people, and that could be as simple as understanding where your product market fit is, who are your customers. You might not have huge traction, but you need to have a conviction in what you're trying to do and trying to achieve. So once you figured that out, I think the rest of the process becomes a lot easier. But you need to realize that it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of sweat that needs to go into it, right? And the other thing that I would say is you need to realize that a lot of that work, 90% or 95% of that work is going to be done by you or your teammates in your team, right? Your fundraising team. It's not going to be done by Pitch in Malaysia or whatever platform that you do. Essentially, they serve as a platform, right? They are not the ones who are funneling investors to you and saying, hey, Arun, why don't you do stock to person A, B, and C, and D, and E? That's not the way it runs, So it really depends on your own work and the work that you put in to get these investors on board. So I think the big advice is figure out what you want to do, your product market fit, make sure that you're rock solid on that. And then the second part is realize that you need to invest a lot of time. It's not going to come naturally, right? No one is just going to invest in you without you approaching them, you doing the discussions, you doing the follow-ups and all of that, right? So if you have those two things in mind, I think you'll succeed.
Yeah, because I mean, generally, even for yours, you took about 5 to 6 months to raise the funds, right? So it's like half a year kind of effort thing while you try to build your product and also marketing.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think if you need to have obviously a logical timeline in mind. Of course, you don't want to set it for like 1 month unless you're extremely confident that you have everything aligned, right? So for us, we took that time because we realized that we had to run the business, we had to go out and serve customers in the same time, right? So we needed to space things out a little bit better so that we were not overloaded on top of the work that we were trying to do, right? So we made a logical decision that we wanted to space it out a little bit better and make sure that at the end of the 6 months we succeeded, right? Rather than having a very condensed timeline, or if you have certain commitments that are due and you need that money to fulfill some of those commitments, I think that's not a very good approach, right? So that money should really be raised for you to scale and for you to grow, not so much to pay off liabilities that you might have or commitments that you might have due. And that always adds more pressure, right, on the business. The business should be looking at how do I continue to run my business, raise revenue the normal way, right, which is through selling your products and services. And this money really is there to amplify and to give you an additional push in the right direction.
Yeah, so the money should be used for attacking and not for defending.
Exactly, yes. I agree. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yep.
So to wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience?
No, I think, as a startup that kind of went through it, I think I learned a lot from the process, and I think it is a very interesting journey to go on to ECFs because you talk to people that you probably never talked to before, right? Some of them might be high net worth individuals, some of them might be your family members, your friends, and all of them have a different take of what is important to them, right? For example, your family might not be so interested in what revenue numbers you want to project for in the next 5 years, right? But they might be buying into you, right, as the person, right? But then other people might have very different questions and different requirements. So I think it's a very interesting process because it makes you evaluate your business model. It makes you think about, okay, they've asked me this question. Why did they ask me this question? How can I answer them in the right way that convinces them? So it is a very interesting opportunity, but always be aware, right? ECF and crowdfunding. Obviously, these are equity crowdfunding, right? You're giving away equity in your business. So really know that this is the right approach. And if you want to be aggressive and on the attacking mode, like you mentioned, then maybe it's the right way for you, right? But always know that first and realize that the journey will be quite interesting, sometimes a bit frustrating and stressful. But I think in the end of the day, I learned a lot from the entire journey, whether it's positive or negative. In the end, we succeeded. So we really got a lot out of it. So I wouldn't, if I could go back and do everything again, I would do it exactly the same. I think it was definitely an eye-opening experience, but you get a lot of exposure and you get a lot of visibility, so that's good.
Okay, and you can also get a lot of feedback from especially the retail investors.
Exactly, yeah. So some retail investors, they suddenly just invest $1,000 here, $2,000 there, and you don't know who these people are, and they don't come back to you for asking you any questions, So sometimes you get those very easy kind of situations, but that's not always going to be the case, right? If you think that that's going to happen, 90% of the case is not, right? It's going to be the flip, right? That most probably 95% of the investors that put in money, you're going to have to explain yourself. You're going to follow up with them. You're going to be on their tails all the time, right? And then maybe 1, 2, 3% of the people who are just going to put in 1,000 here. Okay, I have some disposable income. Let me just put it here. Let's see, whether the company succeeds or doesn't succeed. It's a very small investment. So you have those kind of investors as well. But I would say don't count on that, right? Because that would be the easiest approach, and we all like the easy approach, but generally it's never the case.
Yep. Okay, great. So thanks, Arun, for coming on to the show. Check out eVULX down below, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you very much.